This piece of knitting was actually 3 pieces of knitting created with the sew as you go method. 2 of the pieces were knitted on this loom. It's a Kiss Dragon, and 1 was knitted on this Cindwood loom. The gauges are not identical. You can see the Cindwood piece is smaller, and I knew that was going to be the case. But even so, I was able to join them. This is a technique that you use if you don't have enough pegs to do the job you want to do. For example, you want to knit a queen-size blanket, and all you have is a loom with 40 pegs. Very unlikely that will be enough pegs to do it in one pass. But sewing as you go will save the day. There's more than one way to do it, but here's a good one. This is my new blanket, actually half a blanket, very, very bulky, knitted on a custom-made rug loom, actually. But what we're going to do with it can be done on any knitting board or knitting loom. And it's just so easy to see in this one. I thought you'd like to see it. You're looking at the finished edge. So there are some purls there. The end stitch was slipped at the beginning of every row, knitted at the end of every row. The next stitch was purled every other row. And in this gauge, that's enough to create a non-roll edge. Something similar was done at the cast-on. That's just explanation. It's not really part of understanding this project. The thing is, this is only about 20 inches wide, not really wide enough for a blanket. So I need to knit a second panel. And it's easier than you would think to sew as you go. What I just did is I took the cast-on, the very edge loop from the cast-on, and I hung it on the end peg. Now I can cast on the rest of these. Here I have a loop knotted in my piece of yarn to begin the next piece, and I'm going to put it on the same peg that's holding the edge cast-on loop from the previous piece of knitting. Now I'm going to cast on all the way across, and I'm going to do that off camera. This is how I'm going to do it. I'm working one-handed so I can get you really in close. That's a double E-wrap, and I will knit the bottom loop over the top loop all the way across. I'm going to use a loom tool. It's easier for me to use my fingers to show you that. Now I have other whole videos on casting on. By the way, you're looking at me using a custom-made Kiss rug rake, but it would be the same with any loom. The absence or presence of the pins, which is this set of dowels. These are the pegs. These are functioning as the pegs. These are functioning as the pins. That's just a Kiss system that allows us to knit very evenly spaced stitches. But the way the stitches are formed is just the same, so there's no reason to let that confuse you. Now I'll cast on all the way across. The cast on is now complete. The working yarn is over here. You can see it down there. These two are on the same peg, so when I knit across the next time, the blanket will start to get joined. Now it's important to keep the orientation correct. This is the only tricky thing. This is the bottom edge of the piece that's already knitted. This is the side I want to join. The purl side should be up because as the blanket comes down, it'll drop down here. That's where the purl side will come, and the knit side will be over here towards us. So unless I wanted to, for a fashion statement, do one purl side facing and one knit side facing, this orientation is important. This first row, I will knit to the right, slipping the peg where we hung the loop from the previously knitted piece. Knit all the way to the right, knit all the way to the left, and at that point we'll knit them both off together. Alright, the row is knitted, including this stitch, which joined the two pieces together. Now this is the next important thing to remember. There's more than one way to do this, but the way I did it and plan to do it is I slipped the beginning stitch of every row and knitted the last stitch, which means that on the very edge column of stitches there exist half the number of rows for the whole project. That means that my every other row hanging will work perfectly. If I now hang the very next loop, making sure I don't miss any, after this it will be this one, next this one, and they are a little bit big and loose because of that slipping every other row. So they lend themselves very nicely to this process. If I hang it now, then knit across, then knit back and knit it off, we'll be ready to hang the next one. And that's how the whole project will progress. All right, I've already knitted to the right, knitted back to the left. This time I have not yet knitted this stitch, so I can do it in front of you. Wrap. Now both of these loops get knitted over at the same time, and that's how the blanket gets joined. Now we look for the next loop. You can see my working yarn coming through this previous loop. So this must be the one we need. And on we go. Now I can wrap and knit going right. At this point, the knit side is beginning to emerge away from us. Here's the edge I made, which does have some purl stitches to prevent rolling, but you can see the knit columns coming up from them. And the purl side is emerging as expected, coming down the side of the loom away from me. I have yet to knit off this end stitch. Normally I would do it immediately, but I thought you might like to see it again. That was the loop we hung. There is our actual stitch from the row below. Now it's all one thing, and we go up the side of the work. Working yarn's coming through here, so that can't be it. Must be this one. And on we go. And as we progress, you can see that it's getting less confusing. You no longer have to worry about orienting your stitches because there's a logical path to take up the side of the previous panel. At the very edge, you can get twisted around and a little bit confused, but that's only for maybe 2 rows, and after that it becomes perfectly clear. So on we go, and I'll show you how it develops in a little bit. Here's something that can happen to you and you might wonder about. I'm over here, I should be wrapping and knitting this peg, but shouldn't there be 2 loops on it? Yes, there should. This one fell off while I knitted to the right, so I just put it back on. Now you may wonder legitimately why I even put it on in advance, because we could put it on at this point, and you'd be perfectly right. It simply helps me to remember as soon as I have knitted off one to locate and hang the other. And normally the position I'm working in when I'm not filming, they stay put. But if it works better for you to knit up to it and then hang it, then you would not hang it now. You would wrap from here to this peg, knit, 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 knit to the right, knit, 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 knit to the left, and now you would hang it and knit it off. The main thing is, as long as every other row, one loop from the already knitted piece gets hung and included, then the join will come out nicely. And here you can see it developing. It is not invisible, but it is nice looking. Here it is from the knit side, and it's actually much more discreet from the knit side. There's my yarn tail, which I will eventually unknot and weave in. But if you didn't have that to look at, you might not catch on to where it was. Of course, these stitches are spread out a little. That's the effect of the loom, and it happens on almost every loom for the first few rows. And as they come farther away from the pegs, which are pulling them widthwise, the knits will relax inwards, and the stitches will be positioned as these are that are already off the loom. I'm 12 rows up now, and all of this is one piece. The join is right there where I laid my crochet hook. I can see it. I imagine those of you who are experienced knitters can see it easily, but it isn't bad looking, and it will make me a double width blanket. Now let's do it on a more normal gauge of loom. This is a little piece of a Kiss Dragon loom, which is about the same gauge as the original Nifty Knitter hat looms. This is what we're going to do, the same as before, remembering that the purl side should begin oriented as it is towards me, so that I can gradually hang progressively in positions up the work. It'll end up back here with its knit side towards me, same as the remainder of the knitting. I have a loop knotted. Doesn't really matter whether this goes on top or the loop I'm going to hang from the original piece goes on top. It's good to be consistent throughout your project, though. And here I am going to go ahead and double E-wrap in front of you, because it's not very much trouble to get these few stitches on. While I do it, because you understand what I'm doing, I'm sure, I'll comment on why you might want this project. Suppose you only have a loom with 30 pegs. It makes a good-sized hat, but you want to knit a blanket and it's nowhere near enough. You could knit a flat panel with your 30 pegs going back and forth, not round and round. And then you could knit another flat panel doing this sew as you go technique, and you'd end up with a completed blanket. And here we are doing just the same as before. That strand has already been hung, so we look for the next one up the edge. We hang it. And I'm slipping that stitch. We're knitting only every other row on this end one where we're joining. As I think I mentioned, there's more than one way to accomplish this, and sometimes you would choose to knit every row. But to follow these exact instructions, you do not, and you will get a presentable join, which I will show you. So now we're knitting back towards the seam, which is right here. Wrap. There should be 2 loops to bring up and over, and the rest of these are normal. We can see that one's been hung. Ready for this one. Knit away from it. Knit every stitch that's been wrapped over. Knit back towards the join or the seam. There should be 2 loops to knit over on this peg. I'm going to separate them for you just so you can see there truly are. The rest of these are normal. Next loop onto the peg. Remember me telling you that normally I did not drop loops off of pegs, although I did when demonstrating on the gigantic rug rake. You can see what I mean here. It's not difficult to keep everything on the loom when you're knitting on a normal situation. Here I'm able to get the camera where you can see and I can work on the table, so that's no problem. But as before, if you preferred to hang at the very end just before knitting off, we'll do that this one row so you can see how that works. I do think that it's very helpful to get in a repetitive rhythm where you always do the same thing, because it prevents me anyway from forgetting what I'm about. Sometimes I'm not going to sing one for you, but I sing a little song to myself about what I'm doing, and that helps me stay on task. Okay, here I've wrapped all these. I'm going to knit this one over just to hold it, hang the very last of my loops from the edge, knit over, and now we'll knit the rest of these over and be done. Here we are. I'm going to lay my tool on the seam. There it is. And here it is from the back side. Now this is a Cindwood loom. This might be more what you are accustomed to if you're not a Kiss loom knitter. And I'm going to show you that it runs just the same way. I'm going to join the pieces we've already knitted to a piece on here, knowing that the gauge is not likely to be a perfect match, but this is for demo purposes only, so we're not going to worry much about perfection, just about how it works. As before, I've got the bottom, or the cast-on edge, away from me towards the loom. The very edge loop hung on the stitch that I want to begin casting on with. And I'm just going to do 3 or 4 stitches here for demo purposes. We'll double E-wrap cast on. Well, come on now. Knit towards the seam. And I should have 2 loops here to knit over. 1, 2. Let's angle that. 1, 2. Doesn't really matter if I lift them both in one motion or 2 motions. Go up the side, find the next of the long edge strands. Knit away from the seam. I am only turning and twisting things so that in this less than perfect light you get multiple views. It isn't usually necessary to do that. I'm not going to bother to say more about it. You'll just understand what it is I'm about. 2 loops up and over, an additional loop on that end peg. Remember, the method that I'm using here does not involve knitting on that end peg every row. It's every other row. So we knit back towards it. Knit over both loops. Another way to describe what I just tried to say is that after we hang this loop, we're going to slip the stitch. In other words, we just don't wrap it and don't knit it with the working yarn. Sometimes it means don't wrap and don't knit with the working yarn, but that's all there is going on. Here, there is something happening on that peg, but it's not knitting for this row. It's hanging a loop and just letting it rest. Knit away. So we slipped that row. The alternate rows we do knit, and here we go knitting both loops over. I'll hang the final one of my seaming loops. I'll knit to the other side. This is part of the bind off from the previous piece. Knit back towards. Do knit off both of these loops. Now I'll bind off and show it to you. I've got my piece of dragon loom weighting down the part that was knitted on the dragon loom, and here is the part that we just knitted on the Cindwood loom, and here is the seam. Let's look at it from the back. There's the seam on the back. So that is one method of sewing as you go while loom knitting flat panels.